metaphysical synthesis of existence. But such a synthesis is exactly what I am not attempting. I am concerned exclusively with the generalisations of widest scope which can be effected respecting that which is known to us as the direct deliverance of sense awareness. I have said that nature is disclosed in sense perception as a complex of entities. It is worth considering what we mean by an entity in this connection. Entity is simply the Latin equivalent for thing, unless some arbitrary distinction is drawn between the words for technical purposes. All thought has to be about things. We can gain some idea of the necessity of things for thought by examination of the structure of a proposition. Let us suppose that a proposition is being communicated by an expositor to a recipient. Such a proposition is composed of phrases. Some of these phrases may be demonstrative and others may be descriptive. By a demonstrative phrase I mean a phrase which makes the recipient aware of an entity in a way which is independent of the particular demonstrative phrase. You will understand that I am here using demonstration in the non-logical sense, namely in the sense in which a lecturer demonstrates by the aid of a frog and microscope the circulation of the blood for an elementary class of medical students. I will call such demonstration speculative demonstration, remembering Hamlet's use of the word speculation when he says, "There is no speculation in those eyes." Thus a demonstrative phrase demonstrates an entity speculatively. It may happen that the expositor has meant some other entity, namely the phrase demonstrates to him an entity which is diverse from the entity which it demonstrates to the recipient. In that case there is confusion, for there are two diverse propositions, namely the proposition for the expositor and the proposition for the recipient. I put this possibility aside as irrelevant for our discussion, though in practice it may be difficult for two persons to concur in the consideration of exactly the same proposition, or even for one person to have determined exactly the proposition which he is considering. Again, the demonstrative phrase may fail to demonstrate any entity. In that case there is no proposition for the recipient. I think we may assume, perhaps rashly, that the expositor knows what he means. A demonstrative phrase is a gesture. It is not itself a constituent of the proposition, but the entity which it demonstrates is such a constituent. You may quarrel with a demonstrative phrase as in some way obnoxious to you, but if it demonstrates the right entity, the proposition is unaffected though your taste may be offended. This suggestiveness of the phraseology is part of the literary quality of the sentence which conveys the proposition. This is because a sentence directly conveys one proposition while in its phraseology it suggests a penumbra of other propositions charged with emotional value. We are now talking of the one proposition directly conveyed in any phraseology. The doctrine is obscured by the fact that in most cases what is in form a mere part of the demonstrative gesture is in fact a part of the proposition which it is desired directly to convey. In such a case we will call the phraseology of the proposition elliptical. In ordinary intercourse the phraseology of nearly all propositions is elliptical. Let us take some examples. Suppose that the expositor is in London, say in Regent's Park and in Bedford College, the great women's college which is situated in that park. He is speaking in the college hall and he says, "This college building is commodious." The phrase "this college building" is a demonstrative phrase. Now suppose the recipient answers, "This is not a college building, it is the lion house in the zoo." Then provided that the expositor's original proposition has not been couched in elliptical phraseology, the expositor sticks to his original proposition when he replies, "Anyhow, it is commodious." Note that the recipient's answer accepts the speculative demonstration of the phrase "this college building." He does not say, What do you mean? He accepts the phrase as demonstrating an entity, but declares that same entity to be the lion house in the zoo. In his reply, the expositor in his turn recognises the success of his original gesture as a speculative demonstration, and waives the question of the suitability of its mode of suggestiveness with an anyhow. But he is now in a position to repeat the original proposition with the aid of a demonstrative gesture robbed of any of its suggestiveness, suitable or unsuitable, by saying 'it is commodious.' The 'it' of this final statement presupposes that thought has seized on the entity as a bare objective for consideration. We confine ourselves to entities disclosed in sense awareness. The entity is so disclosed as a relatum in the complex which is nature. It dawns on an observer because of its relations, but it is an objective for thought in its own bare individuality. Thought cannot proceed otherwise, namely it cannot proceed without the ideal bare 'it' which is speculatively demonstrated. This setting up of the entity as a bare objective does not ascribe to it an existence apart from the complex in which it has been found by sense perception. The 'it' for thought is essentially a relatum for sense awareness. The chances are that the dialogue as to the college building takes another form. Whatever the expositor originally meant, he almost certainly now takes his former statement as couched in elliptical phraseology, and assumes that he was meaning 'this is a college building and is commodious.' Here the demonstrative phrase or the gesture which demonstrates the 'it' which is commodious has now been reduced to 'this,' and the attenuated phrase, under the circumstances in which it is uttered, is sufficient for the purpose of correct demonstration. This brings out the point that the verbal form is never the whole phraseology of the proposition. This phraseology also includes the general circumstances of its production. Thus the aim of a demonstrative phrase is to exhibit a definite 'it' as a bare objective for thought. But the modus operandi of a demonstrative phrase is to produce an awareness of the entity as a particular relatum in an auxiliary complex, chosen merely for the sake of the speculative demonstration and irrelevant to the proposition. For example, in the above dialogue, colleges and buildings, as related to the 'it' speculatively demonstrated by the phrase 'this college building,' set that 'it' in an auxiliary complex which is irrelevant to the proposition 'it is commodious.' Of course in language every phrase is invariably highly elliptical. Accordingly the sentence 'this college building is commodious' means probably 'this college building is commodious as a college building.' But it will be found that in the above discussion we can replace commodious by 'commodious as a college building' without altering our conclusion, though we can guess that the recipient, who thought he was in the lion house of the zoo, would be less likely to assent to 'anyhow, it is commodious as a college building.' A more obvious instance of elliptical phraseology arises if the expositor should address the recipient with the remark 'that criminal is your friend.' The recipient might answer 'he is my friend and you are insulting.' Here the recipient assumes that the phrase 'that criminal' is elliptical and not merely demonstrative. In fact, pure demonstration is impossible, though it is the ideal of thought. This practical impossibility of a pure demonstration is a difficulty which arises in the communication of thought and in the retention of thought. Namely, a proposition about a particular factor in nature can neither be expressed to others nor retained for repeated consideration without the aid of auxiliary complexes which are irrelevant to it. I now pass to descriptive phrases. The expositor says 'a college in Regent's Park is commodious.' The recipient knows Regent's Park well. The phrase 'a college in Regent's Park' is descriptive for him. If its phraseology is not elliptical, which in ordinary life it certainly will be in some way or other, this proposition simply means There is an entity which is a college building in Regent's Park.